You speak English every day. Maybe it's your first language. Maybe it's the one you learned at school. You use it to order coffee, argue with your sibling, text your friend, whisper sweet nothings, or say things like, sorry, wrong number, to avoid an awkward call. But here's something strange. What if I told you that some of the most ordinary English words you use, sky, egg, give, get, knife, husband, aren't English at all? Not originally. What if I told you that when you say they took it, you're accidentally quoting someone from a smoky Viking village, someone who sailed across a freezing sea, traded a sack of fish for bread, and then married into the English language like it was just another farm to settle? Tonight, we're going back, not to when English was pure, because it never was, but to when English was changing, melting, transforming, word by word, bed by bed, boat by boat, not in royal courts or scroll-filled libraries, but in kitchens, fields, taverns, and yes, longhouses full of goats. We won't talk about grammar rules. We'll listen to how English actually became English by forgetting what it was and borrowing what it needed. Now take a breath. Let the world slow down. The wind's shifting. The night is quiet. And the longboats have just arrived. Hey guys, tonight we're not starting in a cozy cottage or beneath a castle chandelier. No, tonight you wake up to the creaking of longships moored on a misty English shore. You're lying on damp straw in a wooden hut, and outside, the voices don't sound English at all. They're sharper, throatier. You inch toward the door and peek out just in time to see a bearded man trading fish for bread and shouting in what you now know is Old Norse. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your local time and location in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside into a strange hybrid world. You're in England. Sure, but not the England you know. It's the 9th century, and Norse raiders have stopped raiding and started renting land. Some are even farming. They're speaking Old Norse, and surprisingly, many locals understand them, or at least pretend to. What happens when invaders stop burning and start borrowing sugar? You listen to their speech. Short, snappy words, no fuss. You hear egg, sky, knife, husband, words that feel suspiciously modern. That's because these are Viking imports, still hanging around your vocabulary like ancient stowaways. Everyday English is thick with Norse loanwords, and they're not the fancy ones. You won't find Viking roots in cathedral or philosophy. Nope, the Norse gave us the basic stuff. Give, take, hit, call, die, want, get. These are the tools you use to build a sentence, to tell someone to shut the door or pass the salt. Imagine a house built with bricks from another country. Bricks so perfectly shaped. No one remembers they didn't come from your own soil. The coolest part? This influence didn't happen in schools or through textbooks. It happened at muddy markets, in smoky kitchens, in beds shared out of marriage or necessity. Children in mixed households grew up saying they instead of hi. They blended words without caring about their origin, like kids today using slang from TikTok without wondering whether it started in New York or Seoul. Historians still argue whether these changes were peaceful or born from necessity. Did the Anglo-Saxons adopt Norse words to survive commerce or to survive marriage? Because when the woman in your life calls the spoon a skeed and insists dinner's ready, well, suddenly skeed becomes the only word that matters. Your feet crunch over frost-covered ground as you head toward the village green, listening to the sounds of speech drift through the air. Some of it you understand, some of it you don't. But there's one thing you notice. The sentences are getting shorter, the words more direct, the rhythm tighter. English is changing, and it's not subtle. It's shedding its fancy endings and long-winded grammar. Viking English doesn't do decorative. It does practical. It's the IKEA of language, just as effective, with fewer frills. There's a strange beauty to how naturally this integration happens. Two vastly different languages, Old Norse and Old English, don't battle it out in an academic coliseum. They melt together like stew in a cauldron over a shared fire. New words bubble up, some sink, some float. Window, for example, comes from the Norse vindaga, literally wind eye. It makes perfect sense when you think about what windows used to be before glass. Just holes in the wall where the breeze poked through. Wind eye, poetic and breezy, pun intended. You linger near the blacksmith's hut, where even tools seem to speak Norse. That man just asked for a clubba, and when he dropped it, someone muttered ugh in sympathy. Another Viking gift, expressive interjections. That's right, even your annoyed ugh and your confused huh may have Norse DNA. One Norseman offers you something to eat. It's fish, and you're not sure how long it's been buried in salt, but you take it anyway. He says the word for it is fisker. You repeat it. The others laugh, not cruelly, just amused. Your accent's weird. Give it time. This first layer of Norse-English contact is like meeting a stranger at a party and realizing you know the same jokes. Different accents, sure, but the punchlines still land. You don't need a grammar book to understand knife. You just need to get cut once. You're still chewing that salted fisker. Not bad, really, when you overhear a quarrel between two men near the livestock pen. One speaks in the clipped rhythms of Old Norse, the other in an English that's starting to lose its curves. But even more interesting than their words is the structure of their sentences. You're beginning to notice something strange. Verbs are behaving differently. A sheep breaks from the pen, and someone shouts, "He ran," not "he ranneth," or "he hath runned." Just ran. Quick, simple, and, well, oddly modern. You squint. Did the Vikings do this? Turns out, yes. In a way, before the Vikings, Old English verbs were fancier, full of flourishes. They had conjugations for every subject. I run, thou runnest, he runneth. It was a grammatical costume party, but Viking verbs, they didn't dress up, they just showed up and got the job done. Old Norse didn't have the same intricate verb endings as Old English. So, when Vikings started speaking with locals, trading, arguing, marrying, they simplified things. Over time, English verbs began to shed their endings like a snake slipping its skin. Gone was the eth, the est. In came the blunt forms: run, give, take, ride. Historians still argue whether this grammatical shift was truly Norse-driven or simply a natural evolution sped up by contact. But let's be real. When your in-laws don't conjugate, neither do you. And soon, nobody remembers that runneth was ever a thing. And it wasn't just the verbs. You hear someone behind you say, "They took it." They. Now that's a word with a tail. Old English used high for they, but high sounded a lot like he. And things got confusing fast. Enter the Norse there, pronounced roughly there, a clear and efficient third-person plural. The English loved it, adopted it, spread it around like butter on a hot oat cake. Eventually, they, them, and there replaced the native English forms almost entirely. Even today, you can't string together a sentence without using at least one Viking pronoun, and that's wild. Imagine if, instead of they, you still said hi. Try it. Hi are watching us. You sound like a haunted mirror. It just doesn't work anymore. You move through the settlement, eavesdropping. The children mix in both languages don't bother with fancy grammar at all. A little girl calls out, "He come fast." Not cometh, not has come, just come. Technically incorrect as clear. It's linguistic rebellion served with goat milk. A boy nearby yells, "Give me," and not bestow upon me, which his ancestors might have muttered in more Latin-heavy English. And you think, this is how languages change. Not in royal courts or parchment scrolls, but in muddy yards over arguments about turnips. Another day, another shortcut. The Viking mindset is practical. If something's too long, it gets chopped. Verb endings, axed, gendered nouns, gone. Complex conjugation tables, burned like an unwanted Christmas goose. This shift laid the groundwork for modern English's flexibility. While French remained flowery and Latin clung to declensions, English got sleeker, blunt, agile, adaptable, like a well-balanced axe. Now that's about that second-person plural. Old English used G. Norse brought that in there. But over time, things got messy. People needed a way to say you all, eventually, in different dialects. We got ye, y'all, yous, and even yins. But deep down, that linguistic messiness came from too many cooks in the grammatical kitchen, and half of them were Vikings. You turn toward the river, watching a group of traders load up their boats. They grunt directions at each other, using commands you mostly recognize. Bring, take, push, pull. So many Viking verbs survived because they were useful. Action words, not flowery, just efficient. You remember the word skip. Today it means hopping playfully or skipping dessert. But the original Norse skipa referred to ordering, arranging, or outfitting a ship. It evolved, and like many words, softened over time, much like that salted Fisker you're still regretting. So the next time someone tells you English is a pure language, feel free to laugh. English is about as pure as a stew with 20 ingredients and someone else's spoon in the pot. The Vikings didn't just raid, they renovated. Grammar, verbs, pronouns. They stormed the gates and rearranged the furniture. You're passing a group of boys wrestling in the mud. No shoes, no rules, just a lot of yelling. When you hear one of them shout, "They started it," and there it is again. They, that little word seems so basic, so ordinary, but if you spoke Old English before the Vikings showed up, you wouldn't even recognize it. The pronoun they is one of the clearest Norse fingerprints on modern English. The Old Norse word there, pronounced there, was introduced gradually as Norse speakers settled across northern and eastern England. The native English equivalent at the time was hi, a word that sounds eerily similar to he, and sometimes even looked the same when scribes wrote it out. Confusion abounded, why misunderstandings multiplied. Husbands got blamed for things other people did, but the Norse, their, them, and thera were distinct, clean, practical, and the best part, they didn't sound like anything else already in English. So, locals started picking them up. Slowly at first, maybe in marketplaces, then in taverns, and finally in homes. Before long, I was kicked to the curb like a badly brewed batch of mead, and them, and there became the new standard. It's wild, really. These weren't highbrow changes made by scholars debating in candlelit libraries. These were mom and pop language choices made in kitchens and barns and fields. People adopted they because it was useful, because it worked. Historians still argue whether the shift was deliberate or just a result of constant bilingual contact. Did teachers start correcting kids? Did scribes begin writing it down because they heard it that way? No one knows for sure. But one thing's certain. Pronouns don't usually change that fast unless something or someone is shaking the tree. You wander past a wooden fence with a view of sheep nibbling at frozen grass. An older woman points out, "Them sheep not right." Again, them. Even today, in regional English dialects, them gets used where those might be proper. But in this village, grammar's still in beta mode, and it isn't just the pronouns. The word order you hear, subject, verb, object, is starting to lock in. Old English was looser about sentence structure, sometimes placing verbs at the end like German, but Norse syntax was more rigid, and when two languages merge, the simpler, more consistent pattern usually wins. So English shifted toward clarity. They eat bread instead of bread eat they, or bread they eat. Your sleepy brain appreciates this. You spot two men fixing a broken wagon axle. One grumbles, "Their tool's not good." And boom, there's another Viking hitchhiker in the English language. It replaced heora, which frankly doesn't roll off the tongue, nor does him as a possessive. That's right, before the possessive plural was sometimes him. Try that one in a sentence. Him, tools are broken. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence. And what about the rise of themself? Technically not standard English today, but you still hear it. That's a legacy of a time when people were experimenting with how to refer to groups. What's the plural of himself? Who knows? The Viking solution. Invent something new, or fudge it until it works. As you keep walking, you wonder, why did English adopt they, them, and their so eagerly, while keeping most other pronouns intact? Why not replace I with ik, Old Norse for I, or you with thu? Well, those other pronouns were too deeply embedded, too emotionally charged. You don't mess with I, but they, that's them, over there. Easy to swap, less risky. Plus, English desperately needed clearer third-person plurals, and the Vikings, unintentionally, unknowingly, provided them. There's even a modern twist. In recent decades, they has resurfaced in English as a gender-neutral singular pronoun. Someone left their phone. Tell them I'll call later. Language is always evolving, and Viking fingerprints linger, centuries later. So next time you scroll social media and see, "They said it's going to rain," pause and think, that one tiny word crossed oceans, survived sword fights, and beat out a dozen competitors, just to make your sentence easier to say. You find yourself standing in the shadow of a smoky tavern now, where two voices, a gruff Norseman and a weathered Anglo-Saxon, banter over mugs of ale. You don't catch every word, but you understand enough. What strikes you most is how similar their speech sounds. Different accents. Sure, but the words, Some of them are shared. You're listening to the soundtrack of a linguistic merger in progress. This is where the real magic happens. Loan words. Not the scholarly kind about abstract ideas or institutions, but the gritty, working class kind. Words for the stuff you do, the food you eat, the tools you use, the trouble you get into when you've had too much mead. The Vikings didn't roll in and force people to speak Norse at sword point. In fact, they weren't always that pushy. Once they settled, they wanted to talk, to trade, to fall in love, and that meant finding common ground. The result? A steady flood of Norse vocabulary into everyday English. You spot a child chasing a dog and yelling, "Take it!" Simple words. Yet take is a Norse import. So is give. In fact, over 600 everyday words in modern English come straight from Old Norse. Not the fancy stuff. Basic tools. Knife, egg, sky, dirt, window, law, wrong. It's kind of perfect, isn't it? These Vikings, once known for looting and raiding, gave us some of our most peaceful words. Smile, Norse, die, also Norse. The emotional range. Historians still argue whether these words came in mostly through the Danelaw, the large swath of northeastern England where Norse law held sway, or whether they trickled into English from constant contact and mixing elsewhere. It's likely both. Like a Viking stew. The ingredients were local and foreign, and nobody kept a recipe. You walk past the village smithy, where a red-faced man curses about a broken bolt. Yep, another Norse loan. Many words tied to tools, building, and farming came with the Norsemen. If you've ever fastened a band, lifted a husband, originally meaning householder, not just a romantic partner, or counted your freckles, you've spoken their language. Even insults made the trip. Scab, scowl, anger, ugly, all Norse. It's not hard to imagine heated Viking English debates in smoky alehouses, leaving behind a colorful trail of swear-free aggression that still fuels modern comment sections today. One of the quirkiest contributions? The word baggage. From the Norse root baggy. That's right. Your overstuffed carry-on is named after something a Viking might have slung over his shoulder, full of dried fish and old grudges. But it wasn't just nouns. Norse brought in new idioms and expressions, little ways of phrasing that changed English rhythm. You hear a woman mutter, "He's gone out for good." That final phrase, "for good," Norse structure. It's subtle, but it shifted how English phrases built momentum, how meaning hung in the air before landing like an axe in timber. You round a corner and see a group of women washing clothes in a stream. One of them splashes another, who yelps, "Stop it!" Short, snappy, universal. It's hard to know which language it came from anymore. That's the point. These words are so fused, so unremarkable now. We forget they ever had passports. Children especially became the great mixers. They'd grow up with a Norse-speaking parent and an English-speaking one, and by age 5, they were already inventing their own dialect. You imagine one little boy inventing the word scrape, a perfect Norse-English hybrid, or maybe crawl, or rattle. They sound like words made by muddy hands. There's a strange comfort in how natural it all feels. You don't need laws to make language change. You just need people who want to be understood. Hungry people, married people, people who yell out when the cow escapes. So next time you raise a toast or drop your knife in the dirt while looking at the sky, take a moment. You're not just speaking English, you're whispering a Viking memory. You settle on a wooden bench outside the village meeting hall, where the mood is tense. A group of men argue over who owes whom a sheep, or possibly a wife. It's hard to tell. But what is clear is the language they're using. Simple, commanding, oddly familiar. Words like law, wrong, thief, and sale bounce between them. These aren't words from ancient poetic epics. These are courtroom words, marketplace words, words for settling debts, declaring deals, and accusing someone of stealing your goat. Welcome to one of the most surprising legacies of the Vikings. They didn't just swing axes, they brought legal vocabulary. In fact, many of our modern legal terms have Norse roots, especially those tied to everyday justice. The word law itself comes from the Old Norse lagu, meaning something laid down. It entered English and stayed for good. That's right, your modern lawyer has a Viking ancestor in his thesaurus. You lean in closer as someone mutters, "That's not fair." And just like that, another Norse word floats by, fair, from fager, meaning beautiful, fitting, or proper. In Viking England, a fair deal wasn't just a good one, it was one that looked right to the community. Trade words followed the same path. Sale comes from Old Norse sala. Market might be Latin in origin, but the tools and lingo of buying and selling got a Viking makeover. People didn't just sell, they bargained, swapped, traded, and occasionally cheated their way through commerce. And Norse words kept up. Historians still argue whether these words spread because the Vikings imposed their legal systems, or because English folks found their rules clearer. Norse legal codes were surprisingly well organized, with a strong oral tradition. If you wronged someone, there was a process, a fine, maybe some sheep got exchanged, and if things went really badly, maybe an axe got involved, but only after a proper hearing. You stroll into the hall, where someone is describing a land dispute. He uses the word thing, not as in that thing over there, but as in the thing, a Norse public assembly. Yup, the Vikings had parliaments. They were called things, pronounced things, and they were the place to argue, decide, and occasionally storm out dramatically. You sit cross-legged on the edge of the gathering, absorbing the rhythmic, semi-hostile cadence of the speakers. You hear husband again, once more, not strictly a romantic term. It originally meant householder, from Old Norse, husbandi. If you owned land or livestock, you were a husband, whether you had a spouse or not. The romantic baggage came later, nearby. Someone complains about a fellow who didn't pay back a loan. Another Norse word, félagi, meaning a partner, comrade, or companion in business. You raise your eyebrows. That word evolved into fellow, and eventually into phrases like fellowship. Yes, Vikings accidentally gave us the Fellowship of the Ring. You're welcome, Tolkien fans. Even the word trust may carry a whiff of Norse influence, blending with Old English to create a term that implied more than belief. It implied obligation. When a Norseman gave you his word, he didn't just mean believe me, he meant I will stake my sheep on it. Outside, the argument concludes with a grudging handshake. Someone says, "It's settled." Then, another Norse echo. To settle meant not just to agree, it meant to stop wandering, to claim land, to build. And indeed, the Vikings settled in every sense of the word. You stroll past the border of the village now, toward a long stone wall. A man calls after you. Don't stray too far. The next by isn't friendly. Ah, by yet another Norse gift. In Norse, beer meant a farmstead or village, and in modern England, it lives on in hundreds of place names: Grimsby, Derby, Whitby, Selby, Every by town you've passed on a map is a whisper from Viking settlers who marked their presence not with monuments, but with names. So next time you pay a fine, get into a sale, sue your neighbor, or tell your fellow he's being unfair, just know the Vikings are still with you. The wind picks up as you wander farther from the village square. A trail leads past thatched cottages and into fields, where you spot two children arguing over who gets to ride the goat first. Yes, ride the goat. Their argument isn't in perfect English or perfect Norse. It's something in between. Half a sentence in one language, a few words from the other, and neither of them seems to mind. This is what happens when two cultures don't just clash, they coexist. For years, in homes, in barns, in shared beds. You're walking through the Danelaw now, that swath of northeastern England where Norse law was once king, and more than raids or battles. This place gave birth to something far more powerful, linguistic fusion by way of everyday life. You pause outside a longhouse where smoke curls lazily from the roof. Through the open door, you hear a woman scold a man for being late with the milk. Her voice cuts sharp, her words fast, and you recognize both English milk and Norse mjölk in the exchange. She doesn't care which is which, she just wants her breakfast. Inside these homes, children were the true innovators. They grew up in bilingual households, maybe an English mother and a Norse father, or vice versa. They played with half-translated lullabies. They argued using whatever word came to mind first. If one parent said egg and the other said egg, the child said egg because it was easier, and the easier word usually wins. This wasn't state policy. It was breakfast table diplomacy. Historians still argue how deep this intermarriage went. Were Norse settlers welcomed with open arms? Or tolerated because they brought trade? Probably a bit of both. What's certain is that when people share a roof, they end up sharing more than recipes. They share habits, customs, and yes, language. You pass another longhouse, where a boy is being chased for stealing someone's bread. "He took it," the older child yells. Not "he stoleth" or "he hath taken," just took, a past tense verb that didn't exist in Old English before Norse influence made it fashionable. Linguists call this contact simplification, when two languages rub up against each other and start shedding complexity to communicate better. It's like trimming a Christmas tree until all you're left with is the lights. Old English was a tree full of ornaments, gendered nouns, multiple verb endings, elaborate word order. Norse stripped it back to basics. In these blended households, consistency didn't matter. Clarity did. You might say he was taken while someone else said he got taken, and no one stopped the conversation to correct you. The point wasn't perfection, it was being understood, and that's how English lost its case endings. Like a declension murder mystery, no one knows the exact moment they disappeared. But the suspects are definitely bilingual households, Norse-speaking dads, English-speaking moms, and a whole lot of impatient toddlers yelling, "Gimme that." You pause by a low fence where a young couple is carving initials into a wooden post. One set uses runes, the other Latin letters, another blend. You ask what they're doing and they shrug. It's just how we write. Practical, unsentimental, deeply human. Here's another oddity. Even though Norse and English were both Germanic languages and had many similar words, they were just different enough to create confusion. Imagine hearing someone say hus instead of house, or grass instead of grass. Close enough to guess, but not quite right. So people started picking the version that felt clearest. Sometimes the Norse won, like with sky. Other times the English held on, like with earth. But in many cases, both words stuck around, evolving into subtly different meanings. Think sick, from Old English, and ill, from Old Norse. Or wish and want. These aren't just synonyms, they're fossilized negotiations. By now you've wandered into a small hamlet nearby, where an old man greets you with a half grin and a mug of something that smells like boiled turnips and regret. Sit, he says. Just one word, brrr, but it lands with the gravity of a full sentence. Another Norse word, direct, unmistakable. So you sit and sip and realize this is how English became what it is, not from royal proclamations or dusty scrolls, but from side eyes across dinner tables, arguments over chores, and the quiet, everyday compromises of people just trying to get through the day. You finish the mug of boiled turnip mystery brew. It was somehow worse than you imagined, and begin trudging back toward the heart of the settlement. The sun is peeking through the clouds now, and it's a Thursday, or, as the locals would have called it, Thorsdager, Thorsday. Yes, that Thor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, weather, and bad tempers. You glance up and think, it's not just words and grammar. The very structure of your week still bows politely to the Norse pantheon. 4 of the 7 days in the modern English week carry Viking fingerprints. You probably say them without thinking. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but behind each is a Norse god lurking in plain sight, flexing their linguistic legacy. Tuesday is Tuesday, originally from the Old English Tivasdag, but it was soon reinforced by Norse settlers' own war god, Tyr, a one-handed deity who lost a hand to Fenrir, the giant wolf. The overlap was convenient. Same job description, different name. The words started blending like a shared war story. Wednesday? That's Woden's Day, or more Norsely, Odinsdager, Odin, the All-Father, one-eyed wanderer, god of wisdom and poetry and ravens and way too many side quests, while Woden came from Anglo-Saxon roots. The Norse Odin took over the branding, especially in the Danelaw. You can thank him for your midweek slump. Then comes Thursday, Thor's Day, plain and proud. The Norse Thor, hammer in hand, was already famous by the time Marvel got involved. Unlike many other cultural imports, the Norse gods didn't sneak into the English calendar. They strutted. Friday is for Frigg or Freya, depending on which Norse deity you believe claimed the day. Both were associated with love, beauty, and fate. The day may have originated with the Old English goddess Frigg, but again, Norse influence likely boosted her presence. Either way, it's the official pre-weekend party day. So, someone divine was clearly in a good mood. Historians still argue which goddess ultimately won Friday naming rights. Was it Frigg, Odin's wife and goddess of foresight, or Freya, with her chariot pulled by cats and healthy sense of drama? The debate continues, as do Friday night rituals across the world. Saturday, interestingly, breaks the Norse streak. It's Roman, named after Saturn. And Sunday and Monday, also Roman, tied to the sun and moon. The Norse influence didn't quite boot those celestial bodies off the schedule, but it gave the middle of your week a serious Norse makeover. You walk past a carved wooden signpost, Thor's Field Market, open Thursday only. There it is again. You wonder if the people here even realize they're invoking gods every time they talk about their shopping plans. Probably not. That's the charm of linguistic legacy. You don't need to worship a god to use their calendar. You follow a young boy chasing a chicken while yelling, "Come back! Friday dinner!" And it strikes you that timekeeping itself became a blended affair. Days of the week, seasons, even festivals were increasingly shared. Norse Yule blended with Christian Christmas. Pagan midsummer merged with saints' feast days. The whole calendar became a patchwork of beliefs stitched together with everyday need. And the names didn't just shape time, they shaped tone. The days of the week tell you something about how each culture viewed time itself. The Norse days aren't named after concepts like rest or labor. They're named after people, big personalities, gods you could argue with, maybe toast with, possibly blame for bad weather. This approach humanized time. Each day wasn't just a slot on a planner. It was Thor's day, or Odin's day. You woke up not just to a sunrise, but to a cosmic patron overseeing your chores and mischief. You glance skyward and mutter, "Happy Thursday, Thor," just in case. A bolt of lightning cracks somewhere in the distance. Coincidence? Probably. So next time you complain about Mondays or count down to Friday, remember, you're invoking ancient gods without candles, robes, or rituals, just by showing up to work. You're strolling past the longhouse again, this time drawn by laughter. Inside, a group of villagers, some old, some young, all cross-legged on furs, are listening to a gray-bearded man wave his hands dramatically. He's telling a story, not reading, not preaching, just telling it. And the crowd is spellbound. This is a skald, a Viking poet, entertainer, historian, and subtle troublemaker. He doesn't just tell stories, he shapes them. His voice is part music, part mockery, part magic, and his influence runs deeper than most people realize, even into the tone and texture of English humor. He finishes a tale about a bear in a bishop's bed, and half the room erupts in laughter. The other half groans. That's a sign of a good joke, one that walks the line between absurd and just maybe true. The skald begins again, this time with a mock insult aimed at one of the fishermen. It's sharp, clever, and weirdly poetic. Everyone laughs. You lean in. This isn't just entertainment, it's linguistic theater, and it's exactly the kind of oral tradition that left fingerprints all over English sarcasm, dark humor, and storytelling rhythms. Old Norse had a particular flavor of wit. It was dry, deadpan, often brutal. The Icelandic sagas are full of one-liners that would make a modern stand-up comic nod in approval. He was tall and strong, unlike his mind. That kind of thing. Historians still argue how much of this humor made it directly into English, but there's no question that the style left its mark. English developed a kind of sneaky sarcasm not commonly found in other languages. Irony became a second language in itself, and some of that comes from Viking oral traditions, those fireside roasts, riddles, and yes, even kennings. Ah, kennings. These were metaphorical phrases used by Norse poets to replace simple words. Instead of saying sea, you'd say whale road. A sword became a wound hoe. Fire was a house destroyer. It's poetic, vivid, and just a little extra, and it wormed its way into English poetic tradition through contact with skalds. You see the bearded man lean back, sipping ale, and challenge the listeners. What do you call a man who can't hold his drink or his sword? No one answers. A Dane's disgrace. Groans. More laughter. Jokes aside, this kind of verbal play shaped how stories were told and received. English eventually evolved into a language comfortable with understatement, sarcasm, and wordplay. Look at Shakespeare, or British comedy, or even modern memes. The roots go far deeper than Monty Python. Some of them wind back to Vikings calling each other walrus-faced weaklings over a fire. You step outside into the twilight air and hear two kids trading insults in rhyme. Goat breath. Fish brain. It's almost charming. And you think, maybe this is how it happened. The mingling of languages didn't just build grammar and vocabulary, it built voice. Take the word scorn. Norse origin. So is mock. And laugh. If your sense of humor includes a little pain, a little darkness, and a lot of timing, you may owe that to Viking DNA in your speech. Even our modern sense of the anti-hero, the grumpy but lovable character, the morally gray warrior with a soft spot, has a Norse ancestor. The sagas were full of complicated figures, people who did terrible things, but who loved their family, people who broke oaths, but made good jokes. These contradictions became acceptable, even compelling. And English storytelling picked that up like a torch in the dark. You pass an old woman plucking feathers from a goose while muttering a string of sharp, quiet insults. You don't catch every word, but one phrase stands out. May your ale go sour before your lips reach it. Oof. That's a poetic burn, worthy of any Viking. So, next time you throw shade, drop a pun, or roll your eyes while delivering a killer comeback, just know, somewhere, a skald is nodding in approval from across the centuries. The air smells like damp earth and peat smoke as you head toward the edge of the village. A farmer trudges past with a cart full of turnips, muttering about rain, and the sign nailed to the cart reads, Grimsby turnips, best in the north. You blink. Grimsby? That's not just a place name. It's a linguistic time capsule. You're about to take a walking tour of Viking England, not through the people, but through the place names. And once you start noticing them, you won't be able to stop. See? When Norse settlers claimed land in England, they didn't just build houses. They renamed everything. Hills, rivers, farms, entire towns. If you've ever driven past a thorp or a thwaite, you've driven through Viking footprints. In fact, over 1,400 English place names have Norse roots. Let's start with the big one. By, from the Old Norse beer, meaning farmstead, village, or homestead. It's short, efficient, and everywhere. Think Grimsby, Derby, Whitby, Selby, Weatherby, Kirkby. These aren't just cute-sounding towns. They were once Viking outposts, named after the people who founded them. Grimsby, for instance, means Grim's farm, Grim being a perfectly normal Viking name, not a mood. Then there's Thorpe, from Thorpe, meaning secondary settlement or outlying village. These were the spin-offs, the Viking suburbs. You'll see it in places like Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes, and Althorpe. It's the medieval version of adding estates at the end of a housing development. Next up, Thwaite, from Thivit, meaning clearing or meadow. Think Braithwaite, Applethwaite, Langthwaite. These names tell you someone hacked down trees and made space for goats, and then named the place after it. Classic Norse pragmatism. Even Kirk shows up in the north. That's Norse for church. So Kirkby, Church Farm. Or sometimes it's Kirkdale, the valley with the church. Simple, descriptive, unpretentious, just like Viking house names probably were. This one's Goat Shed, that one's Big Mud. Historians still argue whether these names were formal declarations or just casual labels that stuck. Did someone ride into town and shout, "This is now Grimsby," while everyone clapped? Or did folks just start calling it that because, well, Grim lived there? No one knows. But the names endured, long after the people changed. The dialects shifted, and the longships sailed home. You pass a faded wooden milestone that reads, "To Weatherby, 8 miles." You whisper, "B," and feel like you've uncovered a secret message. And once you start listening, the whole map of England begins to sound Norse. Even the land seems to be speaking their language. But it's not just suffixes. Many standalone place names have Norse origins too. Scunthorpe, possibly from Skuma's Thorpe, or Skuma's village. Ormskirk, Orm's church. You could practically draw a family tree from the map. Orm begat Sven, who moved to York and founded a kirk. You reach a hilltop and look out over a patchwork of towns and valleys, every name etched with quiet history. Names like Lowestoft, from Hlothver's Toft, Hlothver's Homestead, Normanton, Norseman's Town. These aren't just labels, they're evidence. Even the word dale, meaning valley, has Norse roots, from Dalar. You see it in Wharfdale, Teesdale, Swaledale, soft, winding, scenic, like Viking poetry disguised as geography. And don't overlook the simple fell, hill, gill, narrow valley, beck, stream, and force, waterfall, all of which pepper the northern landscape like Viking runes. When you walk through the Lake District or the Yorkshire Dales, you're moving through Norse nouns come to life. You pass a weary shepherd and ask where the road leads. Down to Beck, past to Thwaite, round by Kirkdale. He says it like it's nothing, like he's not casually reciting Norse etymology in a Yorkshire accent thick enough to spread on toast. So next time you book a train to Grimsby, plan a hike in Langthwaite, or mail a postcard from Whitby, remember this: you're not just visiting England, you're walking through a Viking map, one meadow, one hill, one by at a time. As twilight settles over the village, you wander toward a cluster of children scratching letters into the dirt with sticks. At first, it looks like gibberish, but then you notice something familiar. A K, a skay, and what's that? A silent letter? You kneel beside them, and it hits you. You're watching phonetic history unfold. Because when the Vikings came, they didn't just bring words. They brought sounds. And English hasn't spoken the same since. Let's talk about one of the weirdest quirks in English. The silent K. You know the ones. Knife, knee, knave. They all start with that mysterious K you never pronounce, like a ghost letter haunting the word. Well, spoiler, people used to pronounce it. Back before vowels went on their great shift, and English lost patience for its own spelling rules. The K was spoken. The Old English knife, knife, had a hard K. So did tinio, knee. But then the Vikings sailed in with their own versions, Nifur, nay, and Norse loved a hard K. They brought the sound, and for a while, everyone walked around saying ku knife and ku knee like it was no big deal. But over time, pronunciation softened, the tongue got lazy, English speakers dropped the K, but kept it in the spelling like a family heirloom nobody could throw away. And it wasn't just the K. The ski sound is another Viking invader still clinging to the language like a barnacle on a ship hull. Before Norse contact, English didn't really use SK sounds at the beginning of it favored sh, so you had shirt, ship, shall, but Norse gave us sky, skin, skill, skull, skirt, All words that entered English directly with their ske intact. Even more fun, in some cases, both versions survived. Take shirt, Old English, and skirt, Old Norse. Today, they mean different garments, but originally, they meant the same thing, same root word, two accents, and your wardrobe got twice the vocabulary. Historians still argue whether these pairs were deliberately separated by class, gender, or region. Did nobles wear shirts while farmers wore skirts? Did northern accents cling to Norse sounds longer? No one's sure. But English, ever the hoarder, said, "Why not both?" You hear someone behind you say skip, as in, skip that part. Another Norse gift. Skipa in Old Norse meant to arrange or assign, but the meaning morphed over time. The ski stayed, even as the rest of the word wandered. And these sounds changed more than just spelling. They shifted the rhythm of the language. Viking speech was brisk, punchy, full of consonants and short vowels. Old English was denser, more melodic. When the two met, it was like jazz colliding with punk rock. The result? Something surprisingly flexible. Take scrape, scratch, scare, skid, screech. All Norse-derived, all aggressive, action-packed words that added muscle to English's vocabulary. And this influence isn't gone. In fact, many of the words you use when things go wrong, crash, skid, snarl, scramble, have Norse origins or phonetic patterns. When life falls apart, you curse like a Viking. Quietly, of course. You approach a wooden signpost carved with symbols. Some are letters. Others look like runes. You trace your fingers over one that resembles a jagged S, and realize you're touching a lost sound. One the Vikings brought, but time erased. English pronunciation is still weird today, and this is partly why, when Norse met English, sounds got borrowed, mutated, and misremembered. Sometimes two letters made one sound, sometimes one letter made two. Eventually, spelling froze, but speech kept evolving. The result? Chaos. Delicious. Viking-flavored chaos. That's why we write gnome, not, knife, and night, but pronounce none of those opening consonants. It's a mess, but it's our mess, and it tells a story. One where invaders didn't just conquer land, they rewired tongues. So next time you roll your eyes at English spelling, or trip over a silent K in a spelling bee, take comfort in this. Somewhere in the 10th century, a Norse settler sat down, scratched his head, and said, "You say it how?" You follow a dirt path that leads to the riverbank, where a small boat bobs lazily in the shallows. A pair of men are unloading sacks of dried fish, ropes, and barrels with grunted commands. One yells, "Hoist that mast," and the other snaps back, "Then steer it proper." You pause, hoist, mast, steer. You've heard these words all your life, but today, you're hearing them with new ears. This isn't just small talk, it's Viking seamanship preserved in English. Let's get nautical. The Vikings were master seafarers, and they didn't just bring violence when they came across the North Sea. They brought an entire maritime vocabulary, most of which is still bobbing around in English, centuries later. Start with ship. That one's Old English. True. But the vocabulary used on and around the ship, that's where Old Norse really flexed. Take starboard, from Old Norse stjornbordi, the steering side of the ship, or keel, from kjolur, the structural spine of the vessel, or rudder, oar, sail, anchor, crew, ferry, raft, mast, plank, float. These weren't borrowed words, they were adopted out of necessity. You can't talk about boats without boat words. And if your neighbors are better at sailing than you steal their vocabulary along with their livestock. Even skipper, meaning the boat's captain, comes from the Old Norse skipari, a shipman. Same with fleet, from floaty. There's a reason naval terms in English have a briny, guttural ring to them. That's the Norse throat at work. And the verbs? Row, sail, sink, float, drag, haul, tow. Many are Norse or were reshaped by Norse influence. These weren't words invented in courtrooms or monasteries. They were forged on the waves in spray, wind, and shouted curses. You climb onto a dock where a young boy is trying to tie a knot. Unsuccessfully. An older fisherman barks, "Not like that. Tighten the loop or you'll drift like a fool." You watch the boy nod and mumble, Ani. Another Norse touch, from a, meaning always or yes. That tiny word still clings to sailors, pirates, and stubborn grandparents. Historians still argue which regions absorbed the most Norse nautical terms. The eastern coast, especially the Danelaw zones, soaked them up like sea foam. But even inland, the terminology spread. Trade routes flowed like rivers, carrying language along with goods. A farmer in York might not have sailed a ship, but he'd know what tide, storm, or flood meant. And all of those have Norse roots too. Even the idea of the sea as something to be navigated, rather than feared, likely owes a lot to Viking attitudes. Old English poetry often described the sea as a dangerous, punishing place. The Vikings? They called it say, a road, a challenge, a friend. That mentality changed how people thought about travel and how they talked about it. You lean on a weathered post and watch two boats pass on the river. One man calls out, "Which way's the current?" The other shrugs, "It don't matter if you row strong." Another verbal relic. To row is Norse. To current, yes, even that word, comes from the Latin currere, sure. But the idea of talking about water in terms of movement was reinforced by Norse practicality. Even the very concept of voyage owes something to this contact zone. English evolved from a land-based tongue to a sea-based one, not because it had to, but because the Vikings made the sea seem usable, not mythical. You hear gulls overhead and the slap of rope against wet wood, and you think, this is the soundtrack of a linguistic shift, words tied to motion, to wind and water and survival. Words that don't need to be fancy, just fast, clear, and loud enough to cut through the spray. So next time you're on a cruise ship ordering overpriced cocktails, or watching a pirate movie full of dramatic "aye aye, Captain" moments, just know you're reenacting Norse-English language fusion with slightly more sunscreen. You leave the river behind, brushing damp straw from your boots, and head uphill toward a fenced plot of farmland. A few sheep bleat in complaint as a woman shouts at her son to grab the knife and cut the grass before the sky turns. Every word she says, a Viking import. Welcome to the Viking vocabulary of the field and farm. A quiet revolution that seeped into English, not through battles or trade deals, but through chores, mud, and hungry mouths to feed. Let's start with knife. From Old Norse nifr. It slipped into English easily, probably because both cultures agreed. Knives are good to have when your breakfast is still moving. And while we're at it, egg, Norse. You can thank the word egg, Old Norse egg, for making it easier to order brunch without accidentally requesting a chicken fetus in Old English. You wander through rows of winter barley, and another farmer yells out, "Don't forget the husband wants that done by dusk." You flinch. Wait. Husband? Yep. Before it became a romantic title, husband meant householder or landowner, from Old Norse husbandi, literally hus, house, plus bandi, dweller, master. A husband was simply the person in charge of a household, regardless of gender dynamics. Love had nothing to do with it, just oats, just sheep. Rent, and who fixed the roof when it leaked. You crouch near the barn and inspect a pile of dirt, another Norse word. In Old English, drit was used for something far less polite. It meant, well, feces. The Norse version softened into everyday soil. Now, every time you say dirt, you're technically speaking a cleaner version of Viking bathroom humor. The list keeps growing. Sky, from ski, meaning cloud. Originally, sky didn't mean the blue expanse. It meant the clouds hanging in it. It took centuries for English to raise its gaze from just the overcast bits to the whole ceiling. Classic British weather logic. Call is Norse. Die is Norse. Give, get, take. All Norse. These aren't rare poetic words. These are the workhorses of English, worn down from centuries of use. If English were a farm, Norse words would be the pitchforks, boots, and wheelbarrows. Historians still argue whether these words were adopted because they were simpler, more common, or just used so frequently by Norse settlers that English speakers gave in. Probably all three. Try refusing a word when your neighbor uses it every 5 minutes and their goat is standing on your porch. You find a teen boy arguing with his sister over the gate. Yep, another Norse loan. The English had their own words, sure, but the Norse term stuck in northern dialects and eventually worked its way into everyday usage, just like barn, plow, cart, hail, rake, stack, and stead. That's right, farmstead, Norse through and through. It wasn't just vocabulary, it was a way of life. Norse settlers farmed differently. They built homes differently. They counted livestock differently. And with those differences came new terms, many of which worked their way into the English tongue like seeds settling into furrows. A dog barks near the henhouse. "Stop that, you ugly mutt." Someone hollers. Ugly, too, is Norse. Ugliger, meaning to be feared or dreaded. Over time, it shifted toward meaning aesthetically unpleasant, which, depending on the dog, may or may not be fair. You sit down on a tree stump and watch the landscape around you. Muddy boots, wheeled carts, straw, thatched roofs, and human frustration. It's not a war zone. It's not a saga. But it's where language actually changes, not in epic battles, but in everyday repetition. Even the most basic things. Window, sky, egg, knife, husband, dirt, gate, all borrowed from people who just wanted to live, farm, and be understood. If you've ever shouted across a yard for someone to grab the knife and shut the gate, congratulations, you've reenacted a 10th century Norse English domestic drama. So next time you're walking through a garden, complaining about the sky, stepping over dirt, looking for your husband and cutting a sandwich with a knife, just know the Vikings are still there, minding your business, naming your objects. The farmstead quiets as the sun begins to dip behind the hills, casting long gold-pink shadows across the pasture. You step away from the fields and toward a low cottage where an elderly woman is rubbing balm onto her leg and cursing the cold in her bones. "This weather," she mutters. Gets in your skin and stays. Skin. Huh? Another Norse word. You pull up a stool near the hearth and start thinking about all the body parts and beast names in English that come from the Norse tongue. It turns out that even the most personal parts of ourselves, our limbs, our faces, our pain, are often described with words borrowed from folks who once raided monasteries and had extremely strong opinions about snow. Take leg, for example. In Old English, you'd have used sionka, a rather clunky word, but the Norse term legger slid in and won the popularity contest. It was shorter, punchier, and sounded like something you could break while chasing a goat. Then there's skin, from Old Norse skin, meaning a piece of hide or pelt. It originally referred to the outer layer of animals, not humans, but over time, it expanded. Now, thanks to the Vikings, your epidermis has a Scandinavian heritage. You shift on your stool and wince, maybe you slept funny, or maybe this Viking bench has fewer splinters than it used to. Either way, you rub your back, another word with a likely Norse connection. It's one of those terms that isn't clearly documented in Old English texts, but shows up with a suspicious frequency after the Norse arrive. Same goes for neck, scab, bruise, and gait. These words describe how your body moves, breaks, or oozes, and most of them sound like they were invented by someone who regularly fell off horses. Historians still argue whether the influx of Norse anatomical terms came from battlefield triage or domestic cohabitation. Did warriors yell, "My leg," IT after being speared? Or did farmers just get tired of Old English medical terms? Either way, your body is now partly labeled in Norse. You glance over at the hearth, where a young girl is plucking feathers from a chicken. Her little brother, clearly annoyed, whispers, "You're so ugly," another Norse word. Ugliger, originally meaning fearsome or to be dreaded, became our modern word for unattractive. Over time, it shifted from threatening to just unfortunate looking. There's an odd poetry to it. English didn't borrow the romantic or spiritual words from Norse. It borrowed the physical ones, the bruises, the skin, the limbs, the scabs, the stuff you feel when you fall off a cart or stub your toe. And it didn't stop with body parts. Norse also gave us names for beasts, especially the kinds you'd want to either eat, chase, or run from: bull, cow, calf, steak, reindeer, fox, bark, bite, snarl. Many of these came through Norse roots. These were people who had to live with animals, around animals, sometimes as animals if you believe half their legends. Their vocabulary was practical, vivid, and highly transferable. You remember the Old Norse word hundr, dog, and its influence is still audible in hound. Flea also came via Norse. So did muck, mire, and filth. That's right. The words for gross things, Viking approved. Your nose wrinkles at the smell of whatever's cooking. You take a peek. Is that liver? Yep. Norse, again. Lifer in Old Norse. Preserved as a culinary staple and a spelling challenge. The Vikings didn't just teach English how to describe the outside world. They taught it how to name the things that itch, swell, and stink. They labeled bruises and bites, guts and grime. When your body betrayed you, Norse gave you the words to complain about it, and in doing so, they grounded English in something earthy, something physical. English learned to name its aches and pains, its animals and actions, not with abstract poetry, but with gritty, cold-nosed vocabulary forged in barns, longhouses, and battlefields. So next time your leg cramps, your skin itches, or your dog bites your neck while muck sprays from a puddle, remember, you're not just having a bad day, you're having a Viking day. It's almost fully dark now, the moon low and pale in the sky, and yet the village still hums with life. Laughter spills from one cottage, a baby cries in another, and across a packed dirt courtyard, a man and woman are mid-argument over, of all things, whose turn it is to fetch water. You linger, eavesdropping shamelessly, and you hear phrases that feel oddly modern: anger, wrong, hit, fight, wife, husband, home, and you realize something. The language of marriage, manners, and mayhem, that rich, messy tangle of domestic life, has Viking roots, too. Let's begin with the heart of the argument: wife. In Old Norse, it was vif, meaning woman. Not just any woman, but one with a role, status, and usually opinions. Strong ones. The English borrowed it directly and began using it to mean a married woman. Over time, it stuck, firmly enough that it now sounds like a domestic norm instead of a Norse inheritance. Next up, husband, which we met back in the farm field, originally meaning householder. Husbandi. But inside the home, that term began to take on the emotional and marital weight we attach to it now. The wife and husband dynamic, linguistically speaking, was a Norse structure relationship, complete with power, duty, and occasionally shouting over chores. Now, the word home, you guessed it, Old Norse Heimer, the place you belong, the center of your world. It was used in both a literal and symbolic sense, and in English, it's done the same ever since. Home is where the heart is? Sure, but it's also where you yell about soup being too salty. You pass by a group of older women gossiping as they prepare herbs. One whispers, "She was ill. I heard." And the others nod. Another Norse word, iller, once meaning bad, in general, it slowly narrowed in English to mean physically unwell, which tells you a lot about what early Norse speakers thought about being sick. Even the fight itself, Norse. The word fida was all about conflict, and the English version kept it going. Hit, bash, scathe, scold, all have roots in Norse, or were reshaped by contact. If you've ever had an argument that turned into a yelling match where things got ugly, loud, and maybe someone slammed a door, congratulations. You just hosted a Viking-style evening. Historians still argue how deeply Norse customs shaped English domestic life, beyond vocabulary. Did the idea of household equality come from Norse norms? Were Norse women more empowered? Did their traditions of property ownership and divorce influence the English? Some scholars say yes, especially in the Danelaw regions, where Viking-style marriages may have looked different from the Anglo-Saxon church-approved ones. One thing is certain: language reveals what people care about. And the fact that English absorbed Norse terms for home, love, anger, conflict, and parenting tells you something big. This wasn't just a military conquest. This was intimacy. It was bowls of stew, babies screaming at 2 a.m., and people muttering. I swear if he forgets the firewood one more time. You peek inside a nearby house and spot 2 young parents trying to get their infant to sleep. One mutters, "Just let him settle." Another Norse word, setja, meaning to place, to stay put. From it we get settle down, settlement, upset, set off, set out. It's a root word that expanded like a nervous system. Then there's trust, possibly a hybrid of Norse and Germanic influences. It entered English not just as belief, but as binding promise, something you live with, something you break and regret, something a wife says when she hands over the household keys and says, "Don't mess this up." A drunken voice calls out from a nearby door, "You said you'd be home hours ago." I Followed by, "Well, I thought about it," and then slamming, emotional chaos, powered by Norse verbs. You chuckle quietly and keep walking. This, too, is part of the Viking influence. Not swords, not sagas, but real, raw, everyday life. People in love, in conflict, in crisis, using words borrowed across marriage beds, kitchen tables, and long cold nights. So the next time someone scolds you, or you trust someone not to burn the stew, or you return home to your wife after an ugly fight, take a breath and think, maybe the Vikings didn't just change England, they changed how English people argued about feelings. You wake the next morning on a straw mat with an aching back and a vague sense that the chickens got louder overnight. There's a low thrum of voices outside, nothing dramatic, just people talking about crops, weather, debts, the usual. But something in the way they speak makes you pause. It's not just what they're saying, it's how the endings are clipped, the sentences feel lighter. Gone are the flowery case endings of Old English, those extra grammatical suffixes that told you who was doing what to whom. In their place, a leaner, cleaner structure. You're witnessing something radical. The Vikings helped English lose its endings. Let's back up. Old English, like German and Latin. Use cases, nominative for subjects, accusative for objects, dative for indirect objects, genitive for possession. Every noun had a role to play, and each role had its own spelling, often marked by a change in the ending. It was elegant, if you had time to memorize tables. Most people didn't. Then along came the Vikings. Their language, Old Norse, also had cases, sure, but when Norse speakers and English speakers tried to talk to each other, all those endings just got in the way. It was like trying to tango when one person's doing the waltz. So what did they do? They started stripping the grammar down to the bare essentials. No one held a meeting about it. No one said, "Let's kill the dative case today." It just happened. Slowly, organically. Every time someone said "Girv wo wa" instead of "give bread to me," it wasn't proper, but it got the job done. Historians still argue how much of this simplification was Norse-driven versus just an inevitable drift, but the timeline is suspicious. Case endings begin to erode right around the time Norse contact intensifies. Coincidence? Possibly. But also possibly a Viking with no time for nominatives. You step into the longhouse and overhear two people negotiating a trade. You give me 3 eggs, I give you this fish. No suffixes, no pronoun gymnastics. Simple, almost modern English. It's like grammar went through spring cleaning. Another reason Norse may have hastened this shift? Mutual intelligibility. Old Norse and Old English were cousins, similar enough to almost understand each other, but different enough to cause problems. When 2 second languages collide, the result is often a pidgin, a simplified hybrid used just to make things work. That pidgin, over time, became the backbone of Middle English. You pass a child reciting something that might be a prayer, but you notice no inflected verb endings, just plain, punchy words. Go, give, help, take. All verbs that used to carry little tags like eth or est. now dropped, like excess baggage. Even pronouns changed. Remember how them, their took over from Old English equivalents? That shift wasn't just about clarity, it was part of this broader grammatical flattening. English was being sanded down by constant Norse friction, and nouns lost gender too. Not socially, grammatically. Old English had three grammatical genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter, just like modern German. But after centuries of Norse English mingling, all that vanished. Why? Because who has time to remember whether bridge is masculine or sun is feminine when you're trying to barter for ale? Today, English is one of the few major European languages that doesn't assign gender to nouns. You can thank your friendly neighborhood Viking for that, or blame them if you miss the poetic symmetry of Latin. You rest against the barn wall, watching smoke rise into a pale blue sky. A young couple walks by, arguing gently. One says think, the other says thought, and neither corrects the other. They just keep talking. That's the thing about living language. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to move forward. English didn't become a global language because it was beautiful or logical, or it became global because it was useful, adaptable, and flexible, traits it inherited in part from this very moment in time, when Old Norse came crashing into Old English and said, "Let's make this easier." So next time you sigh in relief because English doesn't make you memorize gendered articles or four cases for every noun, raise a toast to simplification, to lost endings, to grammatical laziness, to the Vikings who gave English the gift of being just a little less fussy. The day is growing long, the wind picking up over the low hills, and as you walk back toward the heart of the village, something catches your eye. A boy crouched beside a flat piece of bark, carving odd symbols into it with a dull blade. You kneel beside him. At first glance, it looks like gibberish, but you recognize the curves and angles of runes. He's not writing in Latin. He's writing in Old Norse script. And just like that, we come to the strangest part of this whole story. The Vikings helped change spoken English forever, but they didn't really write it down. Unlike the Romans, the Normans, or even the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings weren't major record keepers. Their oral culture was rich, vivid, and poetic. But their written contributions to English are practically non-existent, aside from the scattered rune stones, inscriptions, and the odd graffiti about who drank the most ale last midsummer, which makes their impact on the language all the more incredible. The Vikings were around for centuries, and they never tried to translate their sagas into English. They didn't write textbooks. They didn't bring grammar guides or glossaries. They just talked a lot, and their words stuck. Runes were important in Norse culture, used for charms, memorials, trademarks, and the occasional curse, but they never became the writing system of the English. Latin had already taken hold in monasteries, and scribes weren't about to swap their quills for axes. You glance at the boy's runes. He's written Trigar or Triger, maybe his father's name. The script is angular, meant to be carved into wood or stone, not inked on parchment. It's built for permanence, not poetry. So, how did a largely unwritten language shape English so deeply? Through conversation, through repetition, through necessity. Historians still argue whether the lack of Viking literary culture was by choice or circumstance. Some believe Norse oral tradition was so revered that writing was considered unnecessary or even limiting. Others point out that runic inscriptions were expensive and time-consuming, and paper was rare. Still others argue the Vikings did write more, but time and damp weather destroyed the evidence. Whatever the reason, the result is this. We know Vikings changed English through sound, not script. You enter a hall where a monk is teaching a group of children to write Latin letters. The air smells of ink and sheet parchment. He corrects one child's G, then sighs at another's attempt to spell sky. That's not a Latin word, he mutters. And he's right. Sky, from Old Norse ski, meaning cloud, didn't belong on his lesson plan, but the children keep using it anyway. Language is evolving faster than their teacher's approval. That's the irony. English absorbed Norse at the spoken level while resisting it on paper. The educated elite kept writing in Latin or Old English long after regular folks had started talking like their Norse neighbors. It created a split, one between how people wrote and how people spoke. Eventually, the two realigned. By the time we reach Middle English, think Chaucer, not Beowulf. Norse influence had fully merged into both everyday speech and the written record. But it took time, and it happened from the bottom up. You sit near a hearth, listening to an old man recite a story. He doesn't read it. He tells it. His rhythm is steady, marked by breath, not punctuation. The words roll out naturally, some native English, others clearly Norse. There's no distinction in his voice, just narrative. Even now, in the 21st century, spoken English is often more forgiving, flexible, and fluid than written English. And that legacy traces back to a time when the Norse helped shape English in conversation, long before a scribe dared to spell sky in a formal document. So, the next time you stumble on a spelling rule that makes no sense, or a silent letter that seems unjustified, or a word that sounds far simpler than it looks, pause and remember, English wasn't built in a library. It was built in muddy markets, shared beds, noisy taverns, and between the breathless syllables of two people trying to understand each other, one in Old English, one in Old Norse. Evening has fully settled in now. A few cooking fires crackle, goats are being herded back into pens, and somewhere off in the distance, someone is singing, not in Latin, not in a formal Old English chant, but something looser, rougher, probably half improvised. You sit on a fence post and let the sound roll over you. The words feel familiar and foreign at the same time. This is the soundtrack of linguistic collision and creation. At this point in your journey, English is no longer Old English. It's something new, something strange, something people later will call Middle English, but no one at the time can quite name. It's what happens when two tongues tangle and refuse to untangle again. Let's get one thing clear. Old English and Old Norse were related, both branches of the Germanic language family. They shared hundreds of similar-sounding words, concepts, and grammatical structures. But similar isn't the same as mutually intelligible. Imagine meeting a cousin from overseas you've never spoken to before. You both kind of understand each other, but also kind of don't. That's what it was like when Norse settlers met English locals. A mix of, yes, I see, and, wait, what? So what do people do when they can't fully understand each other, but still need to share food, raise children, and complain about the weather? They create something new. Linguists refer to this as a contact dialect, a mashup that simplifies grammar, streamlines vocabulary, and evolves at the speed of conversation. It's like a pigeon, but with both sides speaking kind of sort of full languages already, over time, that messy living dialect became the foundation of modern English. You hear it in the simplification of verbs. Old English had strong and weak conjugations, but under Norse pressure, many strong verbs weakened. People stopped saying he holp and started saying he helped. Why? Because it was easier. And Norse verbs followed similar patterns. The collision flattened complexity. You hear it in word choice. When two words meant the same thing, one often edged the other out. Take Norse replaced Nyman, Old English. Sky replaced Heophon. Skin replaced ha. Other times, the language kept both, giving them slightly different meanings over time. Sick, Old English, versus ill, Old Norse. Wish versus want. Historians still argue over how much each language gave and took. Was English the base, sprinkled with Norse vocabulary? Or was it a deeper blend, with grammar and syntax evolving under Norse influence too? Most now agree it wasn't just surface-level borrowing. It was a remodel, not just a redecorating. You hear a young couple walking past you arguing over something trivial. She says, "You should have done it." He replies, "I did do it." And you notice something important. They're using do support. That is a "ne." In modern English, we often use do as a helping verb. Did you go? I do like it. That wasn't common in Old English, but after centuries of Norse-English mingling, it became more natural. Another possible sign that contact forced innovation. The children nearby are still singing, and you listen to their accents. It's subtle, but you can hear the difference between Southern and Northern pronunciations. In fact, much of what we now call Northern English dialects preserve older Norse-inflected speech. Words like bairn, child, kirk, church, beck, stream, and garth, yard, still live on in Yorkshire and Cumbria, like stubborn little time capsules. Even in grammar, Northern English uses "they were sat" instead of "they were sitting," and "she stood there" instead of "she is standing," a structure that mirrors Norse more closely than traditional Old English. These patterns aren't mistakes, they're survivals. The dialects of Middle English, Kentish, West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, were reshaped as they absorbed different amounts of Norse. It's not a coincidence that the London dialect, Mercian-based, eventually became the standard. It sat between extremes, enough Norse to be simple, enough English to be familiar. So here you are, in the middle of a linguistic melting pot, where no one's speaking correctly and no one cares. They're just communicating, getting things done, naming things, forgetting what came from where, letting the old cases drop, letting new rhythms in. It's chaos, but it works. And it works because it's messy, because everyone is bending toward each other a little, because no one is clinging to the past hard enough to stop change. So the next time you say "I didn't mean to," or "she's gone to market," or "they were waiting," know this: those sentences exist not because of logic or Latin, but because two noisy, stubborn, practical languages fell into each other and refused to let go. The longhouse is quiet tonight. Firelight dances across the timber beams as you sit inside, wrapped in a wool cloak, listening to an old woman hum while darning a pair of socks. You lean your head against the rough wooden wall and begin to wonder, was this only a man's story? After all, every history lesson you remember about the Vikings tends to focus on the warriors, the raiders, the seafaring men with braided beards and swords strapped to their hips. But here, in the glow of this quiet domestic space, you realize there's another half of the story, one that shaped the English language just as much. It's time to talk about the women. In the Danelaw, those areas of northern and eastern England where Norse law held sway, Viking women weren't just background characters. They were property owners, traders, household managers, and language carriers. And when they settled, they brought their Norse words, their cultural habits, and their voices into English homes, sometimes quite literally. You hear it in the household vocabulary. Terms like husband, wife, window, cake, and sky weren't passed on through monastic scribes. They were passed through kitchens and bedrooms, from mother to child, from wife to husband. If English borrowed Norse words for domestic life, it's because domestic life was where the languages collided the most frequently and the most intimately. Think about it. Viking women raising children with Anglo-Saxon men, or vice versa. One parent using egg decker, lunch other. Which word do you think the toddler picked? Hint, the easier one, and the one repeated 5 times every breakfast. Historians still debate how much autonomy Norse women had compared to their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. But the sagas are full of women who speak boldly, argue fiercely, and negotiate their own fates. Some scholars argue Norse traditions allowed more rights in marriage, property ownership, and even divorce. And if that's true, then these women likely brought more than words. They brought new social models too. You peek outside the door and see 2 women gossiping while carrying baskets of herbs. One of them says something about a wrong turn her husband made. And you catch a glimpse of that word wrong, from Old Norse ranger, meaning twisted or unjust. It's not a courtroom term here. It's a marriage complaint. Everyday, domestic, and very Viking. The women laugh, sharp, dry chuckles, and you remember that Norse women were known for their wit. The sagas record them dishing out verbal burns like seasoned stand-up comedians. That dry, no-nonsense tone, that made it into English. 2. It may not be quantifiable, but the attitude survived. You walk past a linen-draped cradle, where a baby babbles a mash of sounds. Children growing up in these mixed households weren't scholars. They were little linguistic sponges, absorbing whichever words came easiest or most frequently. In many ways, they were the architects of the new hybrid language that became Middle English, and who shaped the vocabulary of those children most? Not kings, not scribes, mothers, wet nurses, grandmothers, housekeepers. You remember the Norse word kaka, cake. That soft, round word passed from tongue to tongue, likely with sticky fingers and honeyed breath. It didn't arrive through treaties, it arrived through dessert. Thanks. Viking moms, even modern phrases like housewife, hearth, milkmaid, or midwife carry linguistic echoes of Norse. And behind those words, women doing work, telling stories, explaining the world to their children, often in a language that wasn't English, but became part of it anyway. And here's a funny thought. In the modern world, women remain the stronger influencers of language change. Sociolinguists have long observed that women are often the early adopters of new pronunciation shifts and vocabulary trends. If that was also true 1,000 years ago, it wouldn't be surprising that Norse-speaking women played an outsized role in how English evolved. You return to your seat by the hearth. The old woman darning socks hums a lullaby. Some of the words are soft, round Norse syllables. Others, more Anglo. The baby in the cradle listens, but doesn't know the difference. To them, it's just home. So next time you say cake, egg, window, or wife, remember, these aren't just words. They're whispered hand-me-downs from women who crossed seas, made homes in foreign lands, and taught their children how to speak in a voice that became, eventually, yours. You wake to birdsong and the smell of ash and barley porridge, the longhouse now quiet except for the sound of someone stirring a pot with the world's loudest wooden spoon. As you sit up and stretch, your thoughts drift again, not to kings or armies this time, but to something a little more surprising: slang. Because even today, long after the raids ended and the treaties were signed, Norse influence hasn't vanished. It's just gotten sneakier. In fact, many modern English slang words, the ones that feel totally casual, even playful, have roots that stretch all the way back to the Viking Age. Let's start with one that might describe your posture right now. Awkward. It's Old Norse afugjar, meaning turn the wrong way around. Over time, it grew into awkward, used in English to describe someone moving clumsily or behaving unnaturally. And somehow, it also came to define nearly every family dinner from age 13 onward. You toss your blanket aside, another Norse word, blaka, meaning to flutter or flap. It became blake or blacken in dialects, and eventually gave us blanket in Middle English, because nothing is more Viking than inventing something cozy and then pretending to hate emotions. Down the lane, you hear someone yell, "Don't go berserk again." Berserk. A full-throttle Norse term if there ever was one. Berserker, literally bear shirt, referring to Viking warriors who wore animal pelts and allegedly fought in a trance-like rage. Today, it's what you call your toddler when they haven't napped. You start walking through the village, and the word bag pops into your head. Yes, even bag is Old Norse. Baggy. From it we get baggage, saddlebag, and even the delightful insult windbag. It was a practical word, but English made it poetic in all the wrong ways. Then there's get. It came from Norse geta, meaning to obtain or beget. But it didn't stop there. Over time, get morphed into a grammatical Swiss Army knife. You can get going, get better, get lost, or get it over with. Few words are so flexible and so Norse. You hear a group of boys playing with sticks and shouting nonsense. One yells, "You nitwit!" Nitwit. Maybe not Norse in origin, but consider scathe, skulk, snub, snag. All have Old Norse roots. All sound like something you'd mutter under your breath in traffic. The Vikings didn't just give us war terms. They gave us vocabulary for mild personal offense, which is arguably more useful. Historians still argue how much Norse affected everyday English versus more formal registers. Some believe Norse mainly influenced northern dialects and filtered into the mainstream through literature and trade. Others argue the influence was deep and immediate. But either way, it's in our language now, not just in the grand structural ways, but in the weird little words that carry emotional weight. You stub your toe on a rock. Ow. You whisper a few frustrated syllables, some of them definitely Norse. Even expressions like to take off, to fall out, or to run off with someone's sheep may be built on Norse verbal structures, those tidy little phrasal verbs that English now uses constantly. They're what make English feel casual, easy to pick up, hard to master. And when it comes to insults, the Norse influence really shines. In some regional dialects, words like clumsy, dim, and muck-up carry deep Viking roots. So do many animal-related slurs. Ox, pig, cow, dog, rat all used with great poetic creativity in Viking taverns. We suspect you reach a crossroads where a carved wooden sign reads, "Beware, slippery when wet." You laugh. Even slippery has Norse ties, sliper, meaning gliding or sliding. Combine it with a rainy hill, and you've got 1,000 years of continuity and a bruised tailbone. There's a kind of magic in this hidden legacy. The Vikings didn't just change royal bloodlines or map borders. They got into your head, into your speech, into the tiny, messy, sarcastic, deeply human ways we describe the world. So next time you're in a funk, or someone throws shade, or things go totally haywire and you say, "Well, that's awkward. Know this. Somewhere in your sentence is a Viking." The stars are out now, scattered pinpricks across a vast black sky, the kind of sky you don't get to see in the city. You sit outside the longhouse on a piece of worn stone, the night air cool against your face. Someone snores gently nearby. The fire crackles low, and in this quiet moment, you realize something. You're not just surrounded by history, you're speaking it. Because for all the invasions, settlements, arguments, trades, and marriages, the most lasting Viking conquest wasn't of land, it was of language. And here's the kicker. You still speak Viking, whether you know it or not. Let's take stock. When you wake up and open your window, that's Norse, vindauga. When you stretch your leg, legjar, and scratch your skin, skin, that's Norse, too. You might grab your knife, knifar, to cut a steak, steik, or slip on a shirt, skirta, and skirt, skirta, too. Diverged meanings. Same root. You go outside, see the sky, ski, and maybe if you're lucky, pet a dog. Okay, that one's not Norse, but bark, snarl, and muck sure are. You get ill, you get better. Someone gives you tea, and you say thanks, except you don't, because the word thank is Old English. But take, give, all Norse. You complain about your husband, husbandi, or maybe your wife, vef, get into a fight, fita, call it wrong, ranger, and settle, setja, it before bedtime. And bedtime, let's face it, probably involves muttering, "I didn't mean to," using do support, a feature that crept into English thanks to Norse influence on auxiliary verb patterns. Historians used to downplay all this. They thought Norse just sprinkled a few extra words into English. But today, most agree. The Viking impact was profound, particularly on syntax, core vocabulary, and structure. It wasn't just nouns for boats or sheep. It was the grammar itself, the foundation, the stuff you build a sentence on. They came not with scrolls, but with speech, not with dictionaries, but with dialects, and through practical necessity, daily contact, and the beautiful chaos of bilingual children, their words endured. Even now, when you speak English, you're unknowingly quoting Norsemen and their wives. You're repeating the workarounds of medieval families just trying to get dinner on the table. You're echoing contracts made in Danelaw courts. You're living proof of what happens when two cultures don't cancel each other, but combine. And that's the real secret of the English language. It isn't pure, it isn't pristine, it's a mosaic, held together by every people who touched it. It's Germanic at its roots, Latin at its fingertips, Norse in its joints, French in its eyebrows. It's a borrowed suit that somehow fits better than anything tailor-made. And it speaks not of empires, but of compromise, of farms, hearths, and messy family dinners in muddy villages. Of, you say it this way, I say it that way, let's meet in the middle. So next time you open your mouth and say something completely ordinary, like, they took it from me, know this. That sentence is Norse. That rhythm is Norse. That structure is Norse. You are Norse. Just a little bit. And maybe that's the real victory. Not one carved into stone, but one whispered through time. A legacy so embedded in daily life, we forgot where it came from. But now, you know. The fire's almost out now, its glow fading into soft embers. The village around you sleeps. Somewhere, a chicken shifts in its straw. A dog sighs in its sleep. The cold air drifts across your face, but it's not unpleasant. It's clean, crisp, and quiet. You let your body relax against the worn wood of the bench, listening not to voices now, but to silence. A gentle kind of silence, the kind that feels like it's carrying something ancient, like even the hush has a history. You think back on the journey, on words picked up like pebbles from a tide pool, sky, knife, window, give, so many little things you've said without thinking your whole life, and now you know who gave them to you, not gods or kings, but settlers, sailors, mothers, children, people just trying to live and talk and be heard. Language is strange like that. It's never really yours. It's a gift, passed down, worn down, reshaped 1,000 times before it reaches your lips. And that's what makes it beautiful. You close your eyes. The stars blur. The fire dims. The world softens. You don't need to remember every word, or every rule, or every strange Norse vowel. Just know this. When you speak English, you carry the voices of 1,000 years. And tonight, one of them was Viking. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.